I have told this to my clutch daughters 3 times now, and each time they are older, they understand a different layer of it. The youngest hears the rescue. The middle one hears the shame. The eldest has started to hear what I only found at the end. The thing that has no clean word in our tongue. The thing the humans did not name. The thing I have been trying to name myself for 11 years. This is the accounting of what happened to Hive-Mother in the season our air went wrong. We are not a species that asks for help easily. We are chitinous and layered, and proud in the way of things that built their civilization out of hard soil and harder silence. Our hive cities have stood for 4,000 years. Our atmospheric processors were not ancient. They were 60 years old, built by Keth engineers, certified by the coalition's own inspectors. They should have lasted another century. What happened to them is still argued in our technical councils. Whether it was the particulate bloom from the dying Amoran deep forests, or the resonance cascade in Processing Unit 7, simply a design flaw that had waited quietly for the right season to announce itself. The cause does not matter as much as the consequence. The consequence was this. In the span of 11 weeks, the processors at 4 of our 9 primary stations failed to a level beyond field repair. The air above our western hive clusters turned the color of old copper. Our larvae breathe more shallowly than adults and have not yet sealed their respiratory casings, began to show distress. The elders of the deep chambers, casings had thinned with age, followed within a fortnight. I was the Hive-Mother of Amora 7th. It is not a military rank. It is closer to what the humans would call a city administrator, except that a Hive-Mother also holds biological and ritual function. The word carries all 3 at once. I had 8,000 lives in my city, and, by the end of the 4th week, I had 11 field medics managing respiratory failure in the young chambers. My counterpart in Amora 3rd had 22 dead larvae. My counterpart in Amora 1st had sealed the lower levels and moved everyone above the 3rd tier. We sent the request to the coalition on the 31st day. It was not yet a distress signal legally. It was a formal resource petition under Article 14 of the Mutual Aid Compact. The polite version, the one that does not activate emergency priority. The one our senior diplomats advised because, they said, emergency priority petitions tend to create political friction, and we had enough political debt already from the border negotiations of the previous decade. I accepted their advice. I should not have. The coalition sent an automated acknowledgement within 6 hours. They sent a human liaison to confirm receipt within 48, then nothing for 9 days. On the 9th day, response came from the Coalition Aid Allocation Committee, explaining that atmospheric restoration assets were currently deployed to 2 other active crises, that our petition had been received and entered into the review cycle, and that we could expect a preliminary assessment within 60 to 90 standard days. 60 to 90 days. Amora 3rd had 41 dead larvae by then. Amora 7th had 17. My youngest clutch daughter was in the medical tier, breathing through a filtration mask that was meant for field work and was not designed for continuous wear. We escalated on day 40. We filed the emergency designation we should have filed on day 1. The coalition's emergency channel sent a confirmation and a revised timeline, 45 to 60 days for an assessment team. Our senior diplomat, the one who had advised patience, came to me on day 44 and told me that she had done everything correctly. She had followed every procedure. She had been polite. She had been organized. She had submitted documentation in the correct format. She stood in my office and said these things with a steadiness that I recognized as a kind of grief. The grief of a person who has learned that correctness does not guarantee outcome. On day 46, I stopped waiting for the coalition. I opened a general frequency distress channel and broadcast directly on the emergency band. I used the words we had been advised not to use. I said that my larvae were dying. I said the number. I gave coordinates and atmospheric data. I said that I was not asking for a promise or an assessment. I was asking for anyone with atmospheric restoration capability to come. I did not expect a reply. I had by that point a quiet, settled certainty that we were going to manage this ourselves, at terrible cost, or we were not going to manage it at all. The reply came on day 48. It did not come from the coalition. It did not come from any of the species I had considered. It came from a human vessel, A mid-range atmospheric engineering ship registered to something called the Terran Restoration Corps, a body I had genuinely never heard of. The message was short. It said they had received my broadcast, that they were currently 17 transit days out, and that they were already en route. Already en route. They had not waited for my response to their response. They had read the broadcast and turned the ship. I relayed this to my senior diplomat. She read the message twice and said nothing for a long time. Then she said I did not know such an organization existed. Neither did I told her. They arrived on day 65. By that point, I had organized my thoughts about the visit. I had pulled what records existed on the Terran Restoration Corps. Not much. It is a relatively young organization, funded by a coalition of human governments and several private conservation bodies, staffed primarily by environmental engineers, atmospheric chemists, and what the humans call ecological recovery specialists. Their work had been primarily on human colony worlds before this. I had prepared a formal reception. I was ready to be grateful in an organized way. What I was not prepared for was the scale. The first ship that broke atmosphere was the engineering vessel that had answered. A large, workmanlike craft with the Corps insignia on its hull, and what I initially took to be a standard complement. Then the second ship came through, then the third, then two more in close formation, then a vessel so large, I had to check my instruments to confirm it was not a station fragment. It was a seed ship, a designation I had to look up, a vessel designed to carry dormant biological material in preservation matrices, soil bacteria, pollinator analogs, root system networks, hundreds of species of what humans call foundation flora. The kind of cargo you bring when you are not just repairing a system, you are rebuilding one, and behind it. Because apparently this is simply what humans do, a frigate. Calm and unhurried, sitting at the edge of the atmospheric boundary, not as a threat, not positioned for engagement, just there, the way a large and patient thing sits when it has decided it is not leaving. 6 vessels. They had sent 6 vessels for a resource petition that the coalition had placed in a 60 to 90-day review cycle. I met the lead specialist on the landing field at Amora 7th. Her name was something I will not attempt to transliterate here. She had a compact human build, dark skin that caught the thin copper-tinted light, and the kind of calm that I have since come to associate with people who spend their lives working in ecosystems that are trying to die. A patience that has been tested enough to become structural. She wore a filter suit and carried instruments I did not recognize. She shook my primary forearm. Is a gesture humans use in formal greeting that I find unexpectedly direct, and that I have come to appreciate. She said, "We read your data on the transit. I want to walk the processor site first, then the forest edge, then the larval medical tier if you'll allow it. We'll need soil samples from the deep forest floor before we deploy anything from the seed ship. We don't want to introduce the wrong biology." That last sentence stopped me for a moment. We don't want to introduce the wrong biology. It was such a specific concern. It was the kind of thing you say when you have made that mistake before, when you have watched a well-intentioned intervention create a second crisis on top of the first. Shh. It was not the language of someone who had arrived to demonstrate capability. It was the language of someone who had learned something the hard way and was carrying that learning carefully. I asked her, later that evening, as we stood at the observation ridge, above the western processor fields, and watched her colleagues moving through the site in their filter suits, small lights in the copper haze, I asked her how long the Terran Restoration Corps had existed. She told me, the organization itself, about 40 years. But the work it does, the knowledge behind it, the methodology, that goes back much longer. She paused, and she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "We had to learn everything we know about this from our own world. We had a period when we nearly made our air unbreathable, our soil biomes, the deep networks that hold everything else together. We damaged them badly enough that we spent generations in recovery. We didn't always recover cleanly. Some things we lost entirely." She looked at the copper haze above the processor fields. "So when we read a distress signal about atmospheric failure and dying larvae," she said, "we already know what that looks like. We've seen it from the inside." I did not respond to this immediately. I stood on the ridge and watched her colleagues work. And I thought about what it means to receive help from someone who has survived the thing you are currently enduring. There is a specific quality to that help that is different from the help of someone who simply has resources. It is less clean, carries the memory of failure, but it is more precisely calibrated, and it arrives with a different kind of steadiness. The steadiness of someone has no illusions left about how bad it can get, and who came anyway. The work took 19 days. They repaired 2 of the 4 failed stations with components they had brought. On speculation, without knowing exactly what they would find. Because the lead specialist had made her best inference from the atmospheric data in my broadcast and loaded accordingly. The other 2 stations required a different approach. Rather than repair the existing processors, the human engineers proposed a partial bypass using organic filtration arrays seeded from the seed ship's biology banks, working in concert with the remaining functional stations. It was not a solution I would have imagined. It required us to accept that the air quality would not return to pre-failure levels for 2 to 3 years. As the biological systems matured, required patience. It worked. On the 14th day, I was allowed to remove my clutch daughter's filtration mask. She stood in the doorway of the medical tier and breathed, just breathed for a long time. I stood next to her. The air still carried a faint copper note. The organic systems were still young, still finding their balance, but the instrument readings were clean. She was not in distress. She breathed and I stood next to her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying right then. On the 19th day, as the human ships prepared to depart, the lead specialist came to me on the landing field for a final consultation. She gave me documentation, extensive documentation, in our script, translated by someone on her team, covering the maintenance protocols for the organic filtration arrays, the signs of stress in the biology to watch for, contact channels for the Terran Restoration Corps if we needed follow-up support. She had a technician walk our own engineers through everything. She answered every question twice. Before she boarded her ship, I asked her what we owed for the deployment. 6 ships, 19 days, resources from the seed ship, the technical labor. She looked at me with that same structural calm and said, "The Corps is funded for this. Take atmospheric data, if you're willing. The organic filtration approach is new enough that our scientists would value the long-term readings. That would be a fair exchange." "Data," I said. "Data," she confirmed. I watched her ship rise and thought about the coalition's response, still sitting somewhere in a review cycle. I thought about the diplomatic advisors who had told me to be patient, to be polite, to follow procedure. They had not been wrong, exactly. They had been operating in the world as they understood it. A world where help came from certain channels, certain timelines, through certain processes. But that world had not been complete. There had been something else in it, something that did not use those channels or observe those timelines. Something that had apparently been listening to emergency bands for exactly this reason, waiting for a broadcast from someone who had stopped being patient and started being honest about what was happening. Frigate was the last to go. It sat at the atmospheric boundary for a long moment after the others had cleared, the way a careful thing lingers to make sure everything is properly settled. And then it moved away cleanly and was gone. My eldest clutch daughter, who was 8 years old and had watched the departures from the ridge beside me, asked why the humans had come when no one else did. I told her, because they already knew what this looks like. They lived it. And they decided that if they ever heard someone else broadcasting from inside it, they were going to go. She thought about this, she asked, and no one told them to? No one told them to, I said. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I want to understand them better." I put my primary forearm across her carapace, the gesture of close comfort in our custom, and I said, "So do I." That is the thing I have been trying to name. The thing without a clean word in our tongue. The humans have a version of it. I have read their literature on the subject, and they have several candidates, none of them exact. The closest I have found is an old one, from one of their ancient natural languages, and it translates roughly as this: the knowledge that a wound can become a form of expertise, that what broke you, if you carry it carefully, becomes the most precise tool you will ever hold. They carried it to Kethamora on day 65. They carried it in 6 ships and 19 working days and a seed bank full of living things. We breathe their work every day. The organic filtration arrays are mature now, 11 years on, and the air quality has exceeded pre-failure readings. The deep forest edge, where the lead specialist insisted on planting before we addressed anything else, has expanded by 30%. Clutch daughters play at that forest edge sometimes. They breathe without thinking about it. They don't know, yet, what it costs to breathe without thinking about it. But they will. And when they do, they will know who taught us the price.